For the first video in my new series about religion, philosophy and history, I decided to look at a people that really aren't very well known for their religion or philosophy at all. Of course, the Mongols are much more famous for their armies, and more specifically their cavalry, and the violent way in which they exploded onto the Asian and European scene in the end of the 13th century. Of course, they have a very interesting religion, and there's not just one religion when it comes to what religion were the Mongols, although in this video I'm going to focus on one specifically. Of course, you had various Mongols who at various times and in various places were Buddhist, or a special branch of Christian known as Nestorianism, which is an interesting video topic in itself, as well as obviously later on various Khans becoming Muslim. Although in this video I'm going to look at the native religion of indeed the Mongols and other Turkic peoples who were similar to the Mongols, who came from a similar area and lived in the same nomadic lifestyle on the steppe. And the name of this religion that is given is Tengriism. Now I'm going to be using the name Tengriism. You might have heard it called Tengrianism. Sometimes it's referred to as Central Asian Shamanism or Mongolian Shamanism, or as various other names as well, although most of them sound similar to Tengriism. Now of course, the largest element in Tengriism in the word is Tengri, and this is indeed the name of the god that is worshipped in Tengriism. It's one part of this religion. And this is one of the symbols of Tengriism, which I'm going to look into. And this is how it's spelt in the old Turkic script. And actually this symbol is related to what the traditional home, the traditional house building of the Mongolian society, which we in the West call the yurt, although I believe in Mongolian they call it the gur. And as you can see, the ceiling is then related to this symbol as well, with the various spokes in the same Tengriist symbol being the top of the yurt, because the yurt in many ways is a smaller version, a sort of metaphor for the universe in the Tengri belief system, which makes it very interesting. And of course as well, it has a double meaning, because this can be taken to be a drum, with the various lines going across it being the beaters used with which to beat the drum, as drumming and other instruments are very important for the shamanic practices, which are a part of Tengriism. So of course the main feature of Tengriism is Tengri, and Tengri is the sky god. Now Tengri does have various names in the various languages, because obviously there are different groups who follow Tengriism, as I already mentioned. So in Mongolian, and I'm going to do my best to get these pronunciations right, you have Tengri, and Tengri is indeed the same as Tengri in the Mongolian language, although in Turkish he is called Guktanır. And this is then another name. Of course, both of these come from the meaning of Heavenly Father in the various languages. So Göktürk is one of the names that they use for the early Turks of this period as well. And in Mongolian, obviously, Tenger Etseg is another name that they have for this Heavenly Father figure, as he's referred to. And as well as having Tengri, who is the sky god, he is the lord of the heavens and the skies. In juxtaposition to him, you have Ece, and Ece is the mother goddess, kind of the Gaia type figure in the Tengriist belief system, representing the earth, whereas Tengri is the god of the sky, the celestial heavens, sort of the other side of that. So it's very much about balance in Tengriism. And Tengri is related to quite a few other gods as well, like Zeus in the Greek mythology and Tyr in the Old Norse mythology, the Germanic mythology, who actually once upon a time it's thought was the chief god in that mythology, as opposed to Odin, who later took over and was revered more than Tyr, although originally it's thought that he was on the same level as Zeus in the Germanic pantheon. Of course, the idea of a sky god is
very Indo-European.
And an interesting thing about the link between Tengriism and various of these Indo-European traditions, especially of the sky god, so this figure that's called, I believe, Zeus in Proto-Indo-European, which is where we obviously get from Latin deus, which is god, but also then Zeus in the Greek mythology, and this figure of Tyr in the Viking mythology, or the, I should say, the Norse or the pagan mythology, is that this is much closer to the Tengriist belief than it is to other cultures of the Near East, so the ones that are geographically closer to where Tengriism was founded and was being worshipped, and to those of various other Mediterranean civilizations of the antiquity, which is a very interesting link there. And actually Tengriism has also been brought into Europe thanks to various migrations of people like the Huns or the Bulgars or the Khazars, for instance. So in Hungary, before they converted to Christianity around, I believe it was the 9th or the 10th century, The people there actually had this idea of a Tengriist belief set as well, which is where you get the kind of world tree idea, as I think someone mentioned in a comment recently. But that's just some extra linking in there. So what about the fundamental tenets of Tengriism? Well, first I'm going to have a quick look at the creation story in Tengriism. And essentially they believe that, to begin with, Tengri was a white goose, and he flew for eternity across an eternal expanse of water. And water in this is very much a symbolism for time, as well as for sky. So an interesting point which I'll raise in another of this series is the shift from some gods that started off as sky gods and then became ocean gods. And in a way, it's very interesting because in Hungarian, as I just mentioned, the Hungarians were Tengrists when they came into Europe. Their word for sea is actually Tenger, which is very interesting because, of course, Tengri is the sky god, and in Mongolian, Tenger is sky. So it's interesting to see the overlap there. But with water, there's also this idea that water is eternal, probably the idea of the sea, and obviously then the sky is seen as this great big blue bowl, which is similar to the water. So the creation myth goes that he was this white goose flying over this eternal expanse of water. And then from beneath the water, a figure called Ak-Amma calls to him, and she urges him to create things. So Tengri creates this other figure called Erkishi, and Erkishi isn't as pure and as white as Tengri is, who created him to get over his own loneliness, because obviously he is eternally flying over this expanse of water. And together they create the various worlds, which I'll get into in just a minute. And this is the reason why in Tengriism they believe there is good and bad, because obviously Tengri, who isn't described as being the kind of perfect God as you have in the Abrahamic traditions, where God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, meaning he is all-powerful, all-loving, and all-knowing. But in Tengriism, that's one of the reasons why there is good and evil in the world, because this figure, this Erkishi, he becomes a demon and tries to lead people astray. And it's at this point that Tengri descends into the heavens, takes command of the skies, and he sends animals to guide the people in various forms, which is where you get this kind of idea of totemism in the Tengriist belief set. So this symbol is another important one in Tengrism, and it has a couple of meanings just like with the other one. Now it's actually one of the first things, if you are sleeping inside the yurt, that you will see when you wake up, because you will obviously be on your back, and you look up and this is the top of the yurt with the various poles that are used to construct the yurt meeting in the middle with the kind of overlap in the middle. But it's also a symbol for Tengri at the same time. And obviously the yurt is a very important part of Tengri culture, of the Mongols and the various Turkic peoples who believed in this. And it's thought that it is in a way a similar metaphor for the universe and for the cosmos. And so people only travel in a clockwise motion inside the yurt because it's believed that this is the sunwise way of traveling at the same time. And there's also a very important sense of direction inside Tengrism, that it's believed that everything is on an axis in life. So with the various souls in the body, they all need to be exactly on the right side of the axis or things become imbalanced. So for example, the south side of the yurt is the least important side, so that's where the children sit in the yurt, whereas the western side is seen as where the entrance always is to the yurt. So there's a lot of symbolism behind this, and actually you may recognize this symbol because it is on the flag of Kyrgyzstan, and Kyrgyzstan is one of these eastern nations where there are people who believe in Tengrism. And it's also in a similar way, although it's more the kind of symbolism of Tengri in the flag of Kazakhstan. You there have also the sun, this figure of the this being in the eternal blue sky as well. And actually an interesting fact about Kyrgyzstan is that in the Kyrgyz language, Kyrgyz means 40, and actually 40, this goes back to the time of the Byzantines, when one of the tribes in the region sent 40,000 warriors to aid the Byzantines in an operation against the Persians. And because of this, there are 40 rays on the flag of Kyrgyzstan, all exactly the same size, which is an interesting bit of trivia there. Although there are other explanations for it as well, that there was the national Kyrgyz hero called Manas, and that he actually sent 40 of his men against the Mongols. There's various stories there. But there's obviously a lot of symbolism gone into this, which has been brought into their everyday life. So Mongols, and Tengrists don't really have temples, so to speak. Later on I'm going to cover where they do have shrines, there are holy places, but it's not like there are Tengrist churches or Tengrist mosques or something like that. They don't have a specific building of worship. They do have various sites. Of course, it's a plains culture. These were originally nomads, so it wouldn't really make sense to have places where they'd have monasteries and things like that. It's not like Buddhism, but they do have these places, and I think I'm getting the pronunciation here right, called Owos, and these are a kind of, they are like cairns in a way, but then they have been venerated, and they build things on top of the cairns, a lot of the time with the little flags you see there. These are representative of the various deities of Tengri as well, various spiritual forces, and it's believed that spirits of the ancestors and of animals and other important beings inhabit these places. So this is where, for instance, they will put milk on it. That's one of the dedications they do for the white spirits, and then there are also these black spirits for which they put liquor and other kind of things like that. As I mentioned earlier, in Tengriism there's a very important belief in balance, and this idea of balance comes from living an upright life, from being a good person and from doing good things. For instance, this is very much linked to the environment. If you kill animals for no particular reason, or you disrespect the spirits of a certain place or the animals of a certain place, then this will essentially lead to you getting a bad buyan, and buyan is a term that I'll cover a bit later on, which is very similar to the Hindu or the Buddhist idea of karma. And the reason being is that when there is balance in a person, then it stabilizes the community as well. Obviously, these are small nomadic groups initially, so if you had one person acting odd and not fulfilling their role in the group, then it would have consequences on everyone else. So really it advocates people taking responsibility, being responsible for their actions, and having balance in their lives. And of course, by having balance in a person, you then have balance in the tribal group. And if there's balance in the tribal groups, then it also helps to stabilize in a small way the world. So it's important that everyone who is a believer in Tengrism, every Tengrist, follows this way of keeping balance. As well, related to this is the idea that is similar to the sort of European or Abrahamic idea of the soul, although it is rather different, and this idea is of the Windhorse. And actually the Windhorse idea is that everyone has this Windhorse inside of them, and this is used to communicate with the spirits, but also it's related to how healthy a person is. So if a person has good buyan, they honor the spirits, they don't disrespect them, they honor the environment, the nature, they work well within their clan, within their tribal group, then their Windhorse is said to increase, and this means they can then communicate with greater spirits, and they can also live a healthier life. But if they do bad actions, then their Windhorse decreases and they will essentially become less healthy. Now in Tengrism, it's also again believed that people are the center of their own universe, and this is again leading to that they need to take responsibility because the actions that they do affect everything else as well. They do believe that they are then supported on the ground by the earth goddess, by Eje, and supported from the celestial heavens of Tengri, so people are essentially in the middle of this. And this middling idea is again represented in the worldview of the Tengrists, that there are three different worlds. Now to begin with, the upper world is similar to ours. There are human-like creatures which inhabit this world, but if we were to travel to this upper world, they would be invisible to us and we would be invisible to them. There is a certain barrier between each world, although they are important. Now, it's very bright in the upper world because it's said that there are 7 suns and 7 moons. And the upper world is sort of something that our world should aspire to be. It's like the phrase, and so it will be as is in heaven, it will be on earth. That kind of idea that the upper world is where everyone lives the traditional ways of the forefathers, and that's the way that we should live. Now, we live in the middle world, and if you've ever studied any Germanic mythology, you will be thinking, wow, this sounds an awful lot like the idea of Middle Earth. Midgard is the middle enclosure in Old Norse, and it's the similar idea in Tengrism that people inhabited the middle world between the other two. Then of course we have the lower world, which isn't our world, and there are similar human-like beings, but they only have one soul. And because of this, they are cold-blooded and little dark creatures. It's very dark because the sun and the moon of the lower world are only half orbs, so they don't give as much light and guidance as they do in our world or in the upper world, for instance. And it's believed that when people die, there is a certain belief in reincarnation, that people are reborn in various ways, their souls are reborn into other creatures and start over again. And it's thought that when this happens, one of our souls, because in Tengriism there are 3 souls, one of them goes to this lower world before they are really brought back into another body. But actually sometimes this occurs before a person has died. And obviously if you've been catching the drift of balance, then you'll understand that this isn't a good thing. And this is why a Tengrist might call upon a Bu or an Udgan, both of which are shamans, the first being masculine and the second being feminine, to retrieve their spirits. And this is why you might have seen with shamans, it's sometimes called a shamanistic religion, Tengrism, although it's important to realise that with shamanism, they aren't worshipping the shaman, they are worshipping, obviously, Tengri, and that the shaman is kind of like a priest in the traditional Roman Catholic sense, that people needed a shaman to act as a middleman between themselves and the spiritual. And that's why when you see videos of shaman going into a trance, probably doing some kind of drug or drinking some alcohol or getting into a frenzy to communicate with the spirit world, what they believe they are doing is that while they are in body, still in the middle world, their Windhorse is going to either the upper world, although they hardly ever do this. Most of the time in Tengrism, they are going to the lower world to retrieve a person's soul. Now you might be thinking, well, our idea of the soul is that the soul is inside everyone. This might be your idea, this might not be. And that perhaps if you are a dualist, that then once we die, our body might die, but our soul goes to another place. So if the soul disappears in a body, how is this possible? Well, as I mentioned earlier, there are 3 souls in Tengrism, and one of them sometimes goes adrift, and this is when indeed you need the shaman. Now the shaman doesn't act alone necessarily. It's believed the shaman goes to the lower world either by going into this trance, or sometimes it's believed that they physically go to this lower world, but then obviously they are invisible. Just like if a person becomes ill, you have this kind of idea that the shaman would come and chase them away. That's why you often see shamans doing things like screaming and shouting and banging cymbals and drums and all of this to chase the spirit away, because remember, they believe when you travel between worlds you are invisible, but that doesn't necessarily mean you aren't there. So they also believe in these minor deities, which are called the Tengri. And the Tengri, obviously not to be confused with the big deity, the big powerful deity called Tengri. The Tengri are these smaller ones, and there is it's some debate as to how many there are. The classic number given for the amount of Tengri are 99 demigods living in the sky, and these can be broken down into the white and the black Tengri. Now the distinction is a little confusing. They are both these powerful sort of demigods, almost minor deities in this religion. And the black ones are associated with black shamans, whereas the white ones are associated with white shamans. You need, there's a distinction between the two. A white shaman can't connect with a black Tengri. And the white Tengri are believed to be the forces of good in the world. It's hard to describe without trying to put them into 2 categories, because while they are the forces of good and the benevolent spirits, the black Tengri shouldn't be seen in the Christian or the Islamic or the Jewish idea of evil either, because of course Tengrism is all about balance. So while they believe the white spirits often don't mean harm to humans and the black ones can be more harmful, they don't see the black ones as being bad. They see the black ones as being necessary for the continued balance of the world. And the black ones therefore are often honorated and they are interceded with by the black shamans in times of war, for instance, which means that the black shamans, while they communicate with the maybe slightly dodgier spirits, they are the most powerful shamans in Tengrism. And actually, some of these Tengri have very specific roles to fulfill. One of them is called Bayatir Tengri, and Bayatir Tengri is worshipped again in this kind of idea for heroes in warfare to offer them protection. Another one is Kisaya Tengri, and he is the sort of the patron saint of riches and the souls. So again, this idea of the souls, of keeping things in balance. While another one, of course, is Ayataya Tengri, and he is the equestrian or the horse god. Of course, horses are incredibly important to the Mongolian and Turkic peoples of this time period, especially traditionally when they needed these animals to function. So it makes sense that they have a deity honouring this. The sky of the middle world, it's believed, was held up by the pole star. And it's with the pole star that an important symbol that you might see in Tengrism is created. And it's actually because the pole star, while it's seen as the centre, is taken, and then people would look up into the sky and they would see the constellation of the Plough, also called the Big Dipper. And this constellation, actually, if you take its position in spring, summer, autumn and winter, so it's full year, it forms one of these shapes. And this shape, although it does look an awful lot like a swastika, and the swastika has been used throughout history by various peoples for various reasons. This is the Tengrist reason for using one. And this is why it's an important symbol in Tengrism that you might see. Of course, it outlives its use by fascists in Europe by pretty much 1,000 years, and it's believed that they call this symbol the Tamdeg symbol. So you might see this one quite a lot, and it's just an interesting thing about the astronomy that they had as well. Now, of course, they do have a belief in various forms of afterlife depending on the various souls. So it's thought that the ancestors remain as guides for relatives for generations after they die, which is why ancestor worship is also included in Tengrism, exonerating the ancestors, and sometimes in some cultures they even build special houses for them to stay because they believe they can get guidance and help from the ancestors from beyond the grave, essentially. They then believe that after several generations, these ancestors, obviously by the time that no one perhaps remembered them being alive, they go off into the wilderness, and these ancestor souls go and find a mountain or a stream or a tree or something like that, and they stay around these places, becoming the soul of that place. And this is why it's sometimes called an animistic religion as well, the idea that non-animate objects also have souls, which is another interesting parallel to Hinduism, in which the Atman is the soul of most of these kind of objects as well. It's believed that bushes and trees and mountains have souls. And so in Mongolia, really, if you go back and you ask the people who live around these places, they will know that the names quite a lot of the time are for people who have lived. They believe that the spirits are in these places, which is why they are so concerned with looking after the environment, because they believe that their ancestors are actually there. Their souls are in the streams and in the mountains. And as previously explained, angering these will not lead to good things. It will lead to an imbalance, and that's what they try to avoid in Tengrism. Now, as well, there are other various types of ancestor spirits and animalistic spirits as well, which is again why some people call it a totemistic religion. So some of these, for example, are the blue wolf, the red deer, and the bear. And there was actually a very good book series written about Genghis Khan, who is, of course, probably the most famous Mongol and the one who really founded the empire, called the Blue Wolf series. And the Blue Wolf does come back again and again in the Turkic and Mongolian myth sets about these various creatures that come and give guidance, because of course Tengri is the one who from the heavens sends animals to guide the people, which is very interesting because that then again leads to an interesting parallel with the kind of Odin-like figure who sits of course in Valhall, and he sends Hugin and Munin, his two ravens, and they often come and give aid and advice, and they see things in the world and tell him about it. So it's a very interesting sort of comparison between the two. And of course in the Greek mythologies, Zeus often comes down as a bull, for instance, or as other creatures, Athena, the owl. So it's interesting that this overlap exists between them again. Now, of course, as I've mentioned previously, they have a very specific system of the soul. And there are some interesting comparisons once again with the kind of idea of the soul in the Greek schools of thought. And the soul in Mongolian is called Gut. I know everyone in the Netherlands is now laughing, but this is the name that is given to them. And they believe that you have 3 gut inside the body, I know, instead of 1. One called the soul, and the soul is the special soul that only humans have. Now, the soul is what makes people specific as individuals. It's what leads to the individualism that makes one person different from another. And because only humans have it, it kind of makes sense why they believe that animals are more on the same level as one another. And the soul, again, it goes on to live in nature after people die. So these are the kind of spirits, the soul that goes off into the wilderness and becomes the spirit of a stream or a mountain or a tree, for example. Now, the second type of soul is the army. And the ami is actually also used in their word for animal, again to show, and possibly that is also where we get animal from, the kind of animated, this kind of root in the Indo-European languages. But in Mongolian, that's the same. And this is the idea that Tengri breathed the breath of life to animate things. And we owe our lives to Tengri, and we live our lives and we die because that's how Tengri willed it. And so that's why animals also have this soul, because they are of course animated. And after they die, this soul will reincarnate. And what's interesting is that this reincarnation isn't completely random. It's actually that this soul will reincarnate into a member of the family somewhere down the line, which is perhaps how they explain why people pass on certain traits, or why someone says, oh, you look a lot like your grandfather, or even people much further back in time that tend to have similar interests or some weird connections between people, as does happen. And it's an interesting overlap again with certain cultures. So for instance, in quite a lot of the Anglo and Germanic cultures, people named their sons the same thing as them, or the same as their grandfathers, to keep it alive inside the family. This kind of genetic legacy. And this is again sort of propagated in the idea of the army soul. Now, finally, you have the sun's soul, and the sun's soul is the most base soul, so this is also the one that, for instance, the creatures in the lower world have. And this then goes to the lower world after death to await reincarnation. And these can actually return to the middle world, to our world, as ghosts. Not to spook people, but rather to give advice again, and to comfort grieving relatives, which is, it's quite a nice thought, that this kind of interaction. But then that again explains why they're invisible, because of course the various souls when travelling between the worlds are invisible. Now of course I couldn't really make this video without mentioning the big man himself. And actually one of the most famous Mongols, Genghis Khan of course, is also worshipped in Tengriism as a figure. He's not worshipped as a god, more a minor deity, an important figure, rather like one of the Tengri actually. And he is worshipped both in a white form, which is as his steed, so as his horse, and in a black form, which appears as a rider on top of obviously the steed. And this again goes back to the distinction between the white and black Tengri, between having this balance, which again is perfect on a horse, because then you have the white side being the horse and the rider being the black side, which is also an interesting and more nuanced view of Genghis Khan, who obviously is the hero for the Mongolian people, but a massive tyrant and warlord for pretty much everywhere he encountered. And actually, relics of Genghis Khan were kept at a special monastery kind of thing where people would visit. It shouldn't be seen like going on pilgrimage to Mecca, like completing the Hajj for Muslims or something like that. But people would go and revere these relics in this place. It's in Mongolia, although, it's in China, but the area of Mongolia in China that exists there is a little difficult situation. But unfortunately, these relics were destroyed during the Cultural Revolution in Communist China, thanks to Big Mao, although they have since recreated these relics, and actually a lot of people do come to visit them, especially obviously Mongols. It's incredibly important. Now as well, there is an important sense of direction in the Mongolian way of looking at things in the Tengrist viewpoint. And actually it's thought that from the west, the Tengri of the west are again the white Tengri, and that they made mankind as well as dogs and animals that are used for food. So also horses on this side, because they are the creatures that were created to help humans, that humans could use for food, or obviously dogs are used as watchmen, horses for rides, things like that. And on actually the eastern side, you have the eastern Tengri and the black ones. And it's believed that creatures like the eagle, which it's forbidden to eat in Tengrism because they have this big reverence for the eagle, a lot of the time, because to travel between the worlds, especially from the upper world, people have to transform themselves into birds to get there. Again, this idea of the eternal sky, and that Tengri comes down as a goose or as an eagle sometimes, and so obviously you don't want to be eating one of the deities because that's very bad for balance. So they refuse to eat eagles, as well as sickness and illness, disease coming from the east as well. which is an interesting way to look at things. But then again, they don't view the East as being evil or bad. It's more that it's the necessary juxtaposition for the West, which is obviously the sustenance of life with obviously cattle that they can eat, and then the East has to be this balance between the two, the equal and opposite reaction, which is again sort of a central tenet of Tengrism. And because of this balance, they surprisingly are very anti-dogmatic, which is surprising if you think of the Mongols as being these big tyrants, so of course they're going to enforce their religion on everyone. But actually this is not the case with Tengrism. And there's a very nice quote from Genghis Khan, who is one of the Khans, one of the leaders of the Khanate. And he said that we believe that there is only one God, by whom we live and by whom we die, and for whom we have an upright heart. But as God gives us the different fingers of the hand, so he gives to men diverse ways to approach him. Which I think is a very nice quote. Again, it's very similar to Hindu ideas. A proper Hindu proverb is, for example, that there are many paths leading up the same mountain, which again, when viewed in terms of religion and philosophy, shows that there are more ways than one to interpret God, and that one religion isn't the be-all and end-all, whereas in the Abrahamic faiths, that's not really the case. It's you either follow this one and you end up in the pit of hell most of the time, and traditionally speaking, I don't think that many people in the West especially really believe that everyone who doesn't follow their religion is about to be consumed by the eternal hellfire. Now, again, this leads me on to an interesting point of how has Tengriism survived and how has it interacted with other religions, because it definitely has. Now, there is a form, of course, that the Buddhism has interacted a lot with Tengrism. Now, of course, the various nations where Tengrism is practiced, especially Mongolia, are now largely Buddhist countries. And there is actually somewhat of a mixing between the two, and this is where you get the idea of yellow shamanism. Now, yellow is the colour that the monks wear in Mongolia, so that's why it was sort of chosen, and this is where shamanism has been incorporated into Buddhist ideals. So people can be Buddhists, but still also be shamans at the same time. Something that you'll notice with Western philosophies is that they are much less boxy than ones in or Eastern religions, is that they're a lot less putting people into boxes than Western religions. So Hinduism really isn't a religion. There are so many different forms. It's not like the Roman Catholic Church, which is an entity that you can put inside a box. In the East, it's much more that people choose their own path, and there are literally hundreds of thousands of paths that one can choose. And so it's not that strange in the East that you have a shamanistic tradition being linked into a Buddhist tradition, and this is what happened in Mongolia for hundreds of years. While some aspects of Tengrism and Shamanism were added into Buddhism as yellow shamanism, when Altan Khan converted to Buddhism in the 16th century, obviously changing the national religion of the Khanate in Mongolia, of the Western Mongolian Empire, that some people were not happy with moving to this new religion of Buddhism, and some remained and stayed solely faithful to the Tengrist belief set, and these were called black shamans, and it's thought that this might have come about as a protest to this kind of Buddhism, and that's why shaman practices haven't just been absorbed into Buddhism, as in the West, obviously pagan traditions were absorbed into Christian traditions. You also had a direct continuance of just pure Tengrism as well, which remains today. Now, of course, during much of the 20th century, a lot of these practices were banned because obviously all of this area, most of it at least, came under the jurisdiction of various communist states. So in Mongolia you had a socialist republic, and of course a lot of the other countries where Tengrism is practiced, they came under the jurisdiction of the USSR. And all of these shamanistic practices, whether yellow shamanism or Buddhism, or even the black shamanism, the pure Tengrism, they were all banned and repressed, and shamans could face time in prison, things like that, as well as shamans being murdered by these various states. But of course, today, thankfully, they are allowed to practice once again, and the traditions have survived for the most part, and interest is once again picking up in these native religions of Tengrism and the various shamanistic traditions in the area. So some numbers to look at first is that in Mongolia it's believed that 55,000 people identify as Tengrists. Now, of course, with something like this, unlike with the Roman Catholic, obviously Roman Catholic, again, it's a bit ambiguous. Do you go to church every Sunday? Does that not make you a Catholic? But with Tengrism, it's a lot harder to pinpoint with, to put the finger on. Again, some people could go to the Buddhist monastery one week and then obviously sacrifice a bull to Tengri the other week, and they could identify as either or both. But it's believed that there are 55,000 Tengrists in Mongolia. Now, there are around 850,000 in Russia, obviously the various areas, so you won't find very many, for instance, in the very west of Russia, but some of the Siberian regions. Again, it's hard to measure because a lot of the time on the censuses, they don't ask, are you a Tengrist? It'll be, what religion are you? And one of them will be neo-paganism, so quite a lot of the time, Tengrism is linked into sort of these spiritual faiths, or Slavic neo-paganism, obviously worshipped by the Slavs who are going back to the ancient pagan traditions. But of course, this is my rough estimate. In Turkey, they believe that there are 1,000 people. Of course, the Turks are very proud of, always online for some reason, telling everyone that they were the Mongolians, which isn't actually correct. They are a Turkic people, so they once lived a life similar to the Mongolians, and indeed the languages do have some relation between the two, so then it is coming back into Turkey, but I think 98% of Turkey is still very much Muslim at the time. And in China, again, this figure is huge. I very much doubt that this figure is the actual figure of Tengrists in China, but there could be up to almost 6 million Tengrists in China. If I had to guess, I think it would be at least 10 times smaller. That's a very large number of Tengrists. But there are ethnic Mongolians inside China, and their traditional religion was, of course, Tengrism. But in China, it's always been difficult to express what religion you are. Of course, especially under the stricter communist rule, it's still technically communist, but it's not really. But of course, it's difficult to express your religious views in China. But there could be up to about 5,800,000. Now, finally, in Kyrgyzstan, there are up to, I would say, about or probably more than 500,000 Tengrists there. In Bishkek, the capital, there is an organization, and that has 500,000 members. So I reckon quite a lot of those will probably be Kyrgyzstani Tengrists, or people interested in Tengrism. And interestingly enough, the people interested in Tengrism in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, where there are around 55,000, is that it's mostly the intellectuals who are calling for a move away from Islam, which they see as being an alien and an invasive religion, which ultimately it was. These people weren't Muslims to begin with, but the Islam was spread when the various Khans converted to Islam, or when other peoples like the Turks who became Muslim as well came in. And it's their point of view that they should go back to the Tengrist ideals of taking responsibility for one's actions, being important to society, and back to sort of the native religion of what the peoples here were before they were Muslim. So that's a quick rundown of the numbers. Now, this video has gone on for a very long time, and I know that people asked when I said, would you like to see videos on philosophy, religion and history, and I mentioned the ancient Greeks. A lot of people said, oh god, not the ancient Greeks, there's so much about the ancient Greeks. But I don't think anyone really was expecting that I'd make a video about the Tengrists or Tengrism. So I hope you have enjoyed this video. It's been a bit random, very long, but I feel with philosophy it's very hard to condense it. It's much more of a thing that you have to talk through for quite a while, but I guess some of the guys who are interested in maybe having a History with Hilbert podcast can just stick this on in the background and enjoy it. So I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've learned something new about the Mongols and Tengrism, and just let me know which sort of belief set you'd like to see covered in another one of these videos. I've got a few in mind which I've been mentioning as I've been going through, so it might be fun to make a few comparisons between these various belief sets, and if you want to see some more information, I'll have links in the description below. So thanks very much for watching. I've been History with Hilbert, and this has been my religion. This has been my video on Tengrism and the religion of the Mongols. So this has been the history, and I'm Hilbert.